The day my father looked me dead in the eyes and said, "You're covering Tyler's mortgage this month." I thought I had misheard him. I actually reached up and touched my ear like it was malfunctioning. Because we were standing in his kitchen, in the house I helped him maintain for 11 years, and he was telling me, his daughter, to pay my brother's mortgage. Not as a loan, not as a temporary favor, as though it was simply my turn to contribute to Tyler's existence. And if you think that was the worst of it, stay with me. Because what I found out 3 weeks later made that moment look like a polite disagreement over dinner plans. Subscribe if you haven't already, because this one goes places. Let me take you back to a Tuesday afternoon in October, because that's where this actually starts. Not 5 years ago, not in childhood. Right there, Tuesday, October, my dad's kitchen. I had driven 40 minutes to help my mother hang new curtains in the living room. That's what I did. That's the kind of daughter I was. I drove. I helped. I showed up. My brother Tyler? Tyler showed up when there was something in it for Tyler, and everyone in that house knew it. They just chose not to say it out loud. So I'm standing at the kitchen counter, drinking coffee, and my dad walks in. With this look on his face. That look. The one where he's about to say something that benefits Tyler and he's rehearsed exactly how to frame it so it sounds reasonable. He sets his reading glasses on the counter, sits down, and just says it. Tyler's mortgage payment is coming up on the 15th. Brittany just started her new job and they're a little tight this month. I need you to cover it. I put my coffee mug down slowly. Dad, I'm sorry. What? Just this month, Maya. They're getting on their feet. I looked at him. Really looked at him. You gave Tyler $350,000 to buy that house. As a gift, for the family. Dad, you gave him the money 6 months ago. He's already behind on the mortgage, and here's where it got special. My dad, my 63-year-old father who spent 30 years in real estate and knows exactly how money works, leaned back in his chair and said, "Sometimes young couples need support, Maya. You and Daniel are stable. You'll be fine." I said, "Daniel and I have our own mortgage." He said, "And you manage it just fine. That's why I'm asking you." I stood there for a second, genuinely speechless, and then I said something I'd never said to my father before in my life. "How much is the mortgage payment?" He didn't even flinch. $3,200. $3,200 for 1 month for Tyler's house that my dad had already bought for him for $350,000 that Tyler apparently could not afford to maintain after 6 months, and my mother was right there. In the hallway, pretending to read a magazine, and she did not say a single word. I drove home that day with my hands shaking on the steering wheel. Not from anger, from the sheer dizzying weight of realizing something that had been true my whole life, but that I had spent years explaining away. I was not my father's child. I was his resource. Tyler was his child, and I had spent 36 years making peace with that difference, calling it family dynamics and different relationships, and that Tuesday in October, sitting in traffic on Route 9, I finally let myself say it out loud in my empty car. He has never once done for me what he has done for my brother. Not once. And I cried. Not the pretty kind. The ugly, snot-faced, hyperventilating kind that you never let anyone see. I cried until my throat hurt, and then I wiped my face, and I drove home. Now let me tell you about Tyler. Tyler Collins is 38 years old. He is charming in the way that only truly selfish people can be charming. Effortlessly, automatically, like breathing. He's the kind of man who walks into a room and makes everyone feel like they're his best friend, and then turns around and borrows $50 from every single one of them and never pays a single dollar back. He married Brittany 4 years ago, and Brittany is, how do I say this? Brittany is Tyler in female form, except less funny and more expensive. She drives a car that costs more per month than my family's grocery bill. She has opinions about granite countertops that border on religion, and she has never, in the 4 years I have known her, said thank you for anything. Not at Christmas. Not at Thanksgiving. Not when my mother babysat their dog for 2 weeks. Not once. And my dad thought the sun rose and set on both of them. He gave Tyler $350,000. In cash. Well, in a wire transfer technically. A gift, he said, no strings? For Tyler and Brittany to start their life properly. I found out about the money the same way I found out about most things involving Tyler's financial situation, accidentally. My Aunt Carol mentioned it at Easter dinner. She thought I already knew. She said, "Isn't it wonderful what your father did for Tyler and Brittany?" And I said, "Yes, absolutely." And I smiled and I excused myself and went to the bathroom and sat on the closed toilet lid for 4 minutes, breathing very deliberately. I never said anything. I told myself it wasn't my business. I told myself my dad had worked hard for his money and he could do whatever he wanted with it. I told myself a lot of things, but here's what I had not yet told myself. Why? Why, Tyler? Why $350,000? Why that amount, that specific number? I found out why 3 weeks after the kitchen conversation. This is the part where I need you to really listen. My husband Daniel is a methodical man. He is a structural engineer. He does not panic. He does not catastrophize. He processes information the way a building absorbs wind, quietly, efficiently, through systems you can't see. When I came home that October Tuesday and told him what my dad had said, he didn't say anything for a long moment. He just looked at me and said, "Have you looked at the trust documents recently?" And I said, "What?" Daniel said, "Your parents set up a family trust when you were kids. Do you have copies of the original documents?" I had a copy. Somewhere. In the file cabinet in our home office, in the folder labeled Family. My parents had set up the trust when I was about 12 years old. It was supposed to hold certain assets, my dad's rental properties, a significant portion of his savings, and divide everything equally between Tyler and me upon their passing. Standard stuff. That's what I had always been told. I found the original documents that night, and then I called a lawyer because something my dad had said in the kitchen had been eating at me since I walked out of his house. When I asked him where the $350,000 had come from, because I knew his liquid accounts didn't typically hold that kind of cash, he had said something vague. From the trust. It was always intended for Tyler anyway. From the trust. Always intended for Tyler. I had those words turning in my head like a broken record, and when Daniel said trust documents, something clicked like a key in a lock. I called a trust and estate attorney named Rebecca Holloway on a Wednesday morning. She took my call at noon, and by 2 o'clock I was sitting across from her at a clean mahogany desk, sliding the original trust documents across to her. She read for 12 minutes without saying anything. Then she said, "Ms. Collins, when was the last time you saw an updated version of this document?" I said, "This is the only version I have." She said, "Have you ever been notified that this trust was amended?" I said, "No." She said, "Okay." And she turned the document to face me and pointed to a section near the end. "This document establishes equal beneficiary distribution between you and your brother, 50-50. I said, "Right. That's what I always understood." She said, "But the $350,000 that was withdrawn from this trust to purchase your brother's home would have required your signature as a co-beneficiary in most trust configurations. Did you sign anything?" My blood went cold. I said, "No." She said, "Did anyone ask you to?" I said, "No." She looked at me very carefully and said, "Then we need to find out who authorized that withdrawal. This is where I need you to understand something." At this point, I had been operating on the assumption that my father was unfair and played favorites. I was hurt and angry about that, yes. I had been hurt and angry about it for 36 years. But what Rebecca Holloway was now suggesting was something entirely different. What she was suggesting was that money that was legally also mine, 50% mine, had been removed from the trust and given to my brother. Without my knowledge, without my consent, without my signature. And if someone had signed my name, or if the documents had been altered without notifying me as a required co-beneficiary, then what had happened was not simply favoritism. What had happened might be fraud. I sat in Rebecca Holloway's office and felt the floor shift beneath me. Not because I was angry. Not yet. Because I was genuinely, profoundly stunned. My father, my dad, the man who taught me to ride a bike, who sat front row at my college graduation, who cried at my wedding, he might have stolen from me, and Tyler. Tyler, who called me sis and ruffled my hair and asked me to cover his mortgage. Tyler might have known. I drove home. I didn't tell Daniel everything immediately. I just walked inside, sat at the kitchen table, and stared at the wall for a while. Then I said, "Daniel, we need to get a forensic accountant." And Daniel, without blinking, said, "Already Googling. That's why I married that man." What nobody tells you about discovering that people you love might have betrayed you financially is how long the shock lasts. It's not a single moment. It doesn't hit you all at once and then release. It comes in waves, at weird times, at 3 a.m. when you can't sleep, in the middle of a meeting at work when you're supposed to be reviewing quarterly reports, in the shower when you're just standing there and you suddenly start crying and you're not entirely sure why. I am a financial analyst. I manage multi-million-dollar portfolios for a living. I understand money. I understand numbers. I understand how wealth moves and compounds and how estates work, and I had been sitting 20 feet away from a potential fraud situation involving my own family for, we didn't know yet how long, months, years, the whole time. My mother called me twice that week. I let it go to voicemail both times. She left messages about nothing. About a new restaurant she wanted to try. About whether Daniel and I were coming for Thanksgiving. Normal, cheerful messages in that voice she used when she was pretending everything was fine. Tyler texted me. "Hey sis, Dad said you were helping. Out with the mortgage thing. You're literally the best. We'll pay you back ASAP, promise." With a little heart emoji. I read that text 17 times because what Tyler didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the forensic accountant, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Diane Perkins, had already started pulling records. And what Rebecca Holloway was already doing was filing a formal request to review the trust amendment paperwork that apparently existed. An amendment my father had made 2 years ago. An amendment I had never been told about. An amendment that, according to the original trust terms, required notification of both beneficiaries. I had never been notified. I sat alone with that knowledge. For 2.5 weeks, I sat alone with it. I went to work. I smiled at my colleagues. I went grocery shopping. I cooked dinner. I kissed my husband. And underneath all of it, I was building something. Quietly, carefully, brick by brick. I was building the truth. My dad called once. He said, "Did you take care of that thing for Tyler?" I said, "I'm working on it, Dad." I was working on it. Just not the way he thought. Here is what Diane Perkins found. In September, 2 years ago, my father had amended the family trust. The amendment changed the beneficiary structure. It reduced my share from 50% to 20% and increased Tyler's share to 80%. It also included a provision allowing the trustee, my father, who was also the acting trustee, to make distributions to beneficiaries during his lifetime with the consent of both named beneficiaries. Both named beneficiaries, meaning me and Tyler. Meaning my father needed my signature. Or at minimum, my written notification and a waiting period of 60 days during which I could object, before he could pull $350,000 from that trust and hand it to my brother. He had done neither. Instead, on the withdrawal, authorization documents on the lines that should have carried my signature or my acknowledgement, someone had signed my name. I looked at the copies Diane had pulled. I stared at my name, written in a signature that was meant to look like mine. And it wasn't terrible, honestly. Someone had practiced, but it wasn't mine. My capital M curves differently. My lowercase a closes at a different angle. I've signed my name approximately 9,000 times in my professional career. I know what it looks like. That signature was not mine. I showed it to Daniel. He looked at it for a long time. Then he said, "Maya, who would have had a sample of your signature? To practice from?" I thought about it. "Tyler. Tyler has copies of documents I've signed. We co-signed a card for Dad's 62nd birthday. He handled the printing. He would have had the digital file." Daniel nodded slowly. Rebecca Holloway, when I showed her, used a word I'd never heard her use before in 2 months of working with her. She said, "Okay, just okay." Then she picked up her phone and called someone, and she said, "I need a handwriting analysis referral, today if possible." The handwriting analyst confirmed within 10 business days that the signature was not mine. It was a forgery. Now I want to be very clear about something. Rebecca Holloway was careful, very careful. She told me that we had to build this case meticulously. She said, "The moment they know what we know, they will start covering tracks. So we don't tip our hand. Not yet. We document everything, we file in the right order, and we move when we're ready." So that's what we did. Diane continued pulling financial records. The trust had held approximately $890,000 at the time of the amendment 2 years ago. After the $350,000 withdrawal for Tyler's house, the remaining balance was approximately $480,000, already reduced by my father's legitimate living expenses and some smaller distributions. But Diane found something else. There had been 2 other distributions from the trust in the 18 months before Tyler's house purchase. One for $42,000, one for $67,000. Both with authorization signatures, both not mine. $109,000 in 2 separate withdrawals, on top of the $350,000. I sat with that number for a very long time. My brother and my father had taken, between the forged signatures and the uninformed amendment, nearly $500,000 from a trust I was equally entitled to, and had handed it to Tyler and Brittany for their lifestyle, and then called me to cover a mortgage payment. I felt many things when Diane put that number in front of me. I'm not going to pretend I felt nothing. I sat in Diane's office and I stared at the window behind her and I breathed very carefully for about 30 seconds. And then I said, "What are my options?" Rebecca laid them out clearly. Option 1, civil litigation. File a breach of fiduciary duty claim against my father as trustee. Pursue recovery of my full 50% of the pre-amendment trust value, plus damages. This was strong and very winnable. Option 2, file a formal police report for forgery and fraud. This involved Tyler potentially facing criminal charges. It was nuclear. Option 3, both. I asked Rebecca how long she thought we had before someone noticed we were building a case. She said, "Thanksgiving is in 6 weeks." I said, "I know." She said, "Are you planning to attend?" I said, "Yes, I absolutely am." And she looked at me with the slight smile of a woman who has won many, many cases, and she said, "Good." The next 4 weeks were the strangest of my life. Showed up. I played the role I'd been playing my entire life. I texted Tyler back warmly. I told him I was working on the mortgage thing. I called my mom and asked about her new restaurant. I called my dad and chatted about the weather and the upcoming holiday and whether he wanted me to bring a pie. He said he loved my pumpkin pie. I said I'd make 2. Meanwhile, Rebecca had filed the civil case documentation. We were 2 days away from serving the papers when she called me with one final discovery. She had subpoenaed the trust records directly from the financial institution, something she was entitled to do under the civil filing, and what she found made my eye twitch. My father had not just amended the trust 2 years ago. He had attempted a second amendment 6 months ago that would have removed me as a beneficiary entirely. Entirely, 0%. That amendment had not completed processing because of a technical error at the financial institution. A wrong account number on a form, and it had been returned for correction. My father had resubmitted it, but because of a filing backlog at the institution, it hadn't been fully processed yet. I was 6 to 8 weeks away from potentially having zero legal claim to that trust at all. 6 to 8 weeks. You know that phrase, by the skin of your teeth? I have never understood it as viscerally as I did the day Rebecca told me that. I had been 20 minutes late to my own inheritance's funeral. But it didn't go through, I said. Rebecca said, it did not go through. And now that we've filed, a freeze has been placed on the trust pending litigation. Nothing moves without court approval. Nothing moves. I nodded. I took a long breath, and I said, okay, let's finish this. The papers were served 3 days before Thanksgiving. My father received his at the house on a Wednesday afternoon. A process server knocked on the door while my mother was unloading groceries from the car, and my dad was watching the news. Tyler received his at his beautiful new house, the one my family's money had purchased, while Brittany was presumably contemplating granite countertop decisions. Rebecca had advised me not to contact them before service. She had advised me not to respond to calls for 24 hours after service. She said, let it land, let them panic, let them call lawyers. Then we talk. I got the first call from my mother at 4:17 p.m. that Wednesday. I did not answer. I got a call from Tyler at 4:23. I did not answer. I got a call from my dad at 4:26. I did not answer. At 4:50, Tyler sent me a text that said, Maya, what the hell is this? Call me now. At 5:03, my mother sent a text that said, Maya, honey, please just call your father, he is very upset. At 5:30, my father called again. I answered. He said, Maya. His voice was different, lower, hollowed out. I'd never heard my father sound like that in my life. I said, hi, Dad. He said, what is this? What did you file? I said, I think the documents are pretty self-explanatory. He said, Maya, we need to talk about this as a family. I said, I'd love to talk about it, Dad. My attorney will be in contact with yours to arrange a meeting. He said, Maya, listen to me. I said, Dad, someone forged my signature multiple times on legal documents involving money that was legally half mine. There's really nothing to talk about until the attorneys are involved. Silence. A long, heavy, terrible silence. And then, in a voice I will remember until the day I die, my father said, quietly, barely audible, I didn't know he was going to do that. I sat with that sentence for 3 full seconds. He didn't know. He didn't know Tyler had forged the signature, which meant my father had fully intended to cut me out of the trust. That part was his. The amendment, the reduction to 20%, the attempt to zero me out entirely, that was my father. But the forgeries. My father was saying, without saying it, that he hadn't known about those. That Tyler had looked at his father's plan to quietly reduce Maya's share, and had decided to accelerate it himself by faking her signature to push through distributions that shouldn't have been approved yet. My father had been stealing from me. Slowly, quietly, over years, through amendments and exclusions. My brother had been stealing from me fast, impatiently, through forgery. 2 different methods. same destination, and my father was now on the phone with me 3 days before Thanksgiving, trying to figure out how to separate himself from my brother's crime while still not fully accounting for his own. I said, "Dad, I'll see you Thursday. Bring your attorney's contact information," and I hung up. Thanksgiving, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking I showed up to Thanksgiving for the drama. You're thinking I showed up to make a scene, to blow it all up at the dinner table in front of the whole family. Here's the truth. I showed up to Thanksgiving because my Aunt Carol was going to be there. My Aunt Carol, who had been the one to accidentally tell me about the 350 at Easter. My Aunt Carol, who, as it turned out, had been named in the original trust as a witness. My Aunt Carol, who Rebecca had already spoken to, in a very careful and very complete conversation 2 weeks earlier. My Aunt Carol, who was also, as I had recently discovered, furious. She had known about the trust for 30 years. She had watched my father build his estate. She had watched him pour every advantage onto Tyler while quietly rerouting my inheritance. She had not known about the forgeries. Nobody outside of Tyler and my father knew about those, though my father was now claiming ignorance. But she had known that something wasn't right for a very long time. She just hadn't known how to name it. Rebecca had helped her name it, so I walked into Thanksgiving with my pumpkin pies. Both of them. I kissed my mother on the cheek. I said hello to Aunt Carol, who squeezed my hand and held it for 1 extra second. I hugged Tyler, who looked at me like he was trying to read my face through a two-way mirror. And I sat down at the table, and I acted perfectly, completely normal for 1 hour and 47 minutes. Tyler kept glancing at me. Brittany was oddly quiet. Someone had told her enough that she was nervous. I could see it in the way she held her fork. My mother was cheerful in that strained, performative way she got when she was scared. She kept offering everyone more sweet potato casserole. Nobody wanted more sweet potato casserole. My dad sat at the head of the table and he looked old. Really old, like something had deflated in him since Wednesday. He ate very little. He laughed at nothing. He looked at me 3 times during dinner, and every time I held his gaze just a half-second longer than comfortable, and then looked away first. We ate. We talked. Aunt Carol told a story about her garden. Daniel talked about a bridge project he was working on. Brittany pretended to be interested in bridge projects. It was exquisite. And then, as my mother was clearing the first round of plates and asking who wanted pie, my father looked at me across the table and said, "Maya, can we talk? After dinner?" I said, "Sure, Dad. We talked after dinner. Not the whole family. Just me, my dad, Tyler, and my Aunt Carol." Brittany hovered in the doorway. My mother did not come in. She stood in the kitchen making far more noise with the dishwasher than necessary, which was her way of telling herself she wasn't hearing what she was hearing. My dad sat across from me in the living room, in his chair, and he said, "I want to explain some things." I said, "Okay." And for the next 20 minutes, my father tried. He really tried. He talked about how he had always believed Tyler needed more support. He talked about how he thought I was strong and independent and didn't need the same help. He talked about how the amendment was meant to balance things out because he'd already helped me in other ways. College tuition, a contribution to my wedding, and Tyler was still finding his footing. I let him talk. Every word was a blade. And I let every one of them land because I needed to hear him say it out loud. I needed to hear him build the architecture of his justifications so I could understand, completely, what he had decided about me. Not in some abstract emotional way, concretely, specifically, the logic he had used to look at his daughter and determine she was the one who needed less. Tyler sat on the couch and said almost nothing. He was watching me the way you watch a bomb. When my dad finished, I said, "Dad, I want to ask you something directly, and I want a direct answer." He said, "Of course." I said, Did you instruct Tyler to use my signature on the distribution authorization forms? Or did he do that independently? My dad looked at Tyler. Just for a half second. But he looked at Tyler. Tyler said, Maya? I said, Tyler. I'm talking to Dad. My father said, I didn't tell him to do that. I said, but you knew the distributions would require my authorization. He said, I thought the trustee could make distributions without. I said, Dad, you've been in real estate for 30 years. You set up this trust. You know what it says. Silence. Long, unbroken silence. The kind that fills a room like water. And then Tyler. Tyler who I had grown up with. Tyler who had borrowed money from me 17 different times over the years. Tyler who had texted me a little heart emoji about covering his mortgage. Tyler looked at me and said something that crystallized everything I needed to know about who he was. He said, Maya, can we just keep this in the family? You're going to ruin everything over money. Over money. I looked at my brother. I looked at the man who had forged my name, who had taken $109,000 from me in quiet, practiced increments, and then had the sheer, breathtaking audacity to text me about how I was literally the best for helping him out. Who had looked at a legal document, at the line where his sister's name was supposed to go, and had decided his comfort was worth more than her rights. I said, Tyler, $350,000, plus $42,000, plus $67,000. That's $459,000 from a trust that was legally 50% mine. And someone signed my name to make it happen. That's not over money. That's fraud. Brittany made a small sound in the doorway. Tyler's face did something complicated. It collapsed and then restructured and then collapsed again. He started to speak, stopped, started again, and then landed on, and I will remember this for the rest of my life. He said, I was going to pay you back. I was going to pay you back. Aunt Carol, from the corner chair where she'd been sitting silently, this entire time said, Tyler, don't say another word. It was the most powerful 7 words I've ever heard anyone say in my life. Tyler looked at Aunt Carol, then at me, then at my dad, and I watched something happen on my father's face in that moment. Not anger, not defensiveness, not even shame. Exactly. Something older and heavier than shame. Something that looked like a man finally, fully, in the presence of what he had actually done. He put his face in his hands, and Tyler, my charming, effortless, golden child brother who had never been accountable for a single meaningful thing in his life. Tyler's voice cracked when he said, Dad, we have to fix this. And my dad said, from behind his hands, I know. Those were the 2 most important words my father had ever said to me in 36 years. Not, I love you. Not, I'm proud of you. Not at graduation. Not at my wedding. I know, said with his face. In his hands, in a living room full of the consequences of his choices. That was the moment I stopped being angry. Not because what had happened was okay. Not because it didn't matter. But because the anger had done its job. It had carried me, from that Tuesday kitchen all the way to this room, and now it could set me down. I was done carrying it. I want to be honest with you about what happened next, because this is not a story where everything wraps up in a neat bow and everyone gets what they deserve, and I walk off into a golden sunset. This is what actually happened. In the months that followed, my father's attorneys and Rebecca worked out a settlement. My father agreed to restore my 50% beneficiary status in the trust. He agreed to a financial remedy that compensated me for the unauthorized distributions. Not in full immediately, but structured over time, with interest, and with legal guarantees so airtight that Rebecca called them bulletproof. The Second Amendment attempt, the one that would have removed me entirely from the trust, was voided by the court. Tyler signed a civil settlement that acknowledged financial harm and committed him to a structured repayment plan. He was not criminally prosecuted, primarily because my father, who claimed genuine ignorance of the forgeries and cooperated fully with the civil process, agreed to make the injured party, me, financially whole. And the financial institution agreed that a civil remedy was appropriate given the full cooperation of all parties. Did I feel that was enough? I'm still working on the answer to that. Some days, yes. Some days I feel the particular sting of watching a charming man sidestep a criminal charge he deserved. But Rebecca told me something that stayed with me. She said, "Maya, you have your inheritance restored. You have the legal record, and you have the truth on paper. Sometimes that is the most durable form of justice. You'll feel it more in 10 years than you do right now." I have thought about that sentence 100 times since. Tyler and Brittany sold the house 18 months later. The lifestyle they'd built on borrowed money and unauthorized distributions from a family trust does not sustain itself when the unauthorized distributions stop. Turns out when the financial foundation of your life is someone else's stolen inheritance, the whole structure is a lot less stable than the granite countertops suggest. I don't know exactly where they are now. I stopped keeping track. Not out of bitterness, out of something closer to release. I decided I was done monitoring the aftermath of their choices. I had enough of my own life to pay attention to. My relationship with my father is complicated. That's probably the most honest thing I can say about it. He called me in January, about 6 weeks after the settlement was finalized, and he said, "I want to tell you that I'm sorry." Not for the first time. He'd said it before, in attorneys' offices and on the phone, but this one felt different. This one didn't have a lawyer on the line. He said, "I've spent 63 years believing that some people in a family need more than others, and I used that belief to justify things I don't know how to forgive myself for." I said, "Dad, I don't know what we are right now, but I know that if you had just asked me, if you had ever just asked me, I would have given Tyler a lot of what you thought you needed to take." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I know. That was the hardest moment of the whole thing, honestly. Harder than the forgeries, harder than the confrontation, harder than sitting in a lawyer's office reviewing evidence of my own family's betrayal. That January phone call was the hardest moment of the whole thing. Because he meant it. Because somewhere underneath all the favoritism and the financial manipulation and the years of quiet inequity, he was still my dad, and he was getting older, and he was ashamed, and none of that erased what had happened. But it also didn't make him a monster. It made him a man who had made terrible choices rooted in a love he didn't know how to distribute fairly. And that's almost worse than a monster, isn't it? A monster you can just walk away from. A flawed human father who genuinely loves you but chose someone else's comfort over your rights every single time for 36 years. That one takes longer to process. I'm processing. I still think about that mortgage call sometimes. That October Tuesday in the kitchen. My dad sitting there, completely comfortable, completely unbothered, telling me to cover Tyler's mortgage like it was the most reasonable request in the world. The confidence it takes to do that. To look at the daughter who has always shown up, always been responsible, always managed fine, and to see not a person who deserved fairness, but a resource who could absorb another cost. The confidence it takes to not even consider, for even one single second, how that request lands on the key person you're making it to. I think about what would have happened if I had just said yes. If I had transferred $3,200 and gone home and thought nothing more of it. If Daniel hadn't mentioned the trust documents. If Rebecca Holloway hadn't asked the right question at the right moment. If Diane Perkins hadn't found those 2 earlier distributions. If the Second Amendment had gone through before we filed, we came so close to me never knowing. That's the part that gets me more than anything else. The proximity of the miss. I was weeks away from losing everything I was owed, and the thing that stopped it was me, sitting in my car on Route 9, crying about curtains and favoritism, and my husband saying 4 words. Have you checked lately? My Aunt Carol calls me every Sunday now. She's the constant in this whole story that nobody talks about. The witness who was there all along, who had watched the inequity for decades and hadn't known how to name it until someone gave her the language. She gardens. She tells me about her tomatoes. She asks about Daniel. She asks about my work. Last month she said, "You're the strongest person in this family, Maya. You always were. You just never needed everyone to know it." I keep that sentence in a place I can reach easily on difficult days. I think about the little girl who grew up in that house believing that fairness was coming, that her turn was next, that if she just kept showing up, kept being responsible, kept being the one who drove 40 minutes to hang curtains, that the scales would balance eventually. That love would distribute itself fairly in the end. I want to tell that little girl something important. The fairness doesn't come to you. You have to go get it. You have to know your rights. Know your documents. Know the laws that protect you. Know the name of a good attorney before you need one. Know that blood is not a reason to stay silent about injustice. And it is definitely not a reason to cover someone else's mortgage when you can barely hold your own. Know that love and fairness are 2 completely different things, and you deserve both. And the absence of one does not obligate you to manufacture peace about the other. I did not cover Tyler's mortgage. I recovered my inheritance. There's a difference. And if nobody in your life has said this to you recently, you are allowed to know what you're owed. You are allowed to protect what is yours. You are allowed to stop being the one who absorbs costs so someone else can avoid consequences. You are allowed to be the resource that nobody thought to account for, right up until the day you decide to account for yourself. My name is Maya, and I am nobody's plan B. If this story hit something in you, subscribe. Share it with someone who needs it today. Drop in the comments what you would have done in that Tuesday kitchen, because I genuinely want to know. And if you're sitting on something in your own life right now, some inequity you've been explaining away, some pattern you've been calling just how they are, some document you haven't looked at in too long, I hope this gave you a little bit of what Aunt Carol gave me, the language to name it. See you in the next one.